Good afternoon or evening, Eleanor and perhaps parents. This is Grandpa Rosler, ready to read a new story for Eleanor. Um, I can't be outside playing on my mower today because we have some rain, which is much needed. But the good news is I get to read you a book. Peter, the Tale of Peter the Rabbit. This is a cautionary tale of what happens when you're naughty. It's by Beatrix Potter and illustrated by Cindy Zakaras. So here's the story of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time, there were four little rabbits. Their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. And there you see the family gathered in their house underneath the root of this fir tree. Now, my dears, said Mrs. Rabbit one morning, you may go to the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put into a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Oh, so sad. A rabbit pie. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I am going out. You see, and she's putting on her hat and scarf and ready to go out. Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. So there she is at the baker's picking out some brown bread and currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, they all happened to be female, went down the lane to gather blackberries. And so there's good Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail gathering blackberries. Boy, they look good, don't they? But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. See him squeezing under the gate? First he ate some lettuce, and then some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. Then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. There you see Peter eating and eating in this garden that Mr. McGregor has worked so hard to put in. I understand you have a garden that you've been working on. Asked your daddy what he would do with rabbits that got in there and ate his new vegetables. But round the end of the cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. Peter lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and another shoe among the potatoes. Imagine that, a rabbit losing their shoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster. So here's Mr. McGregor chasing Peter. See Peter running real fast away from Mr. McGregor. I think I might have got away altogether if it not had, if he had, I think he may have gotten away altogether if he had not unfortunately ran into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. But his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. You know how to implore somebody to exert themselves? Come on, you can do it. Go on, Peter. You can make it. Try a little harder. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop on top of Peter, but Peter wiggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. There he's wiggling out. There's his jacket left. There's the sieve with Mr. McGregor putting it down and Peter scampering away. Peter rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not been so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each one. There's Peter in the watering can, and there's Mr. McGregor looking under the flower pots. Presently, Peter sneezed. Kerchoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time. He tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter, so he went back to his work. So there is Peter running out, upsetting the plants, and escaping from Mr. McGregor. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright. He had not the least idea which way to go. So he was very damp from sitting in the can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. So there's Peter, looking for a way out of this garden. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked. There was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry, and here's the mouse taking peas out of the garden, and there's Peter crying because she can't help him. Then Peter tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to a pond. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still. Peter thought it best to go away. He had heard about cats from his cousin Benjamin Bunny. And there's the white cat sitting by the pond looking at the goldfish. So what do you think the cat would do if he saw a rabbit? Think the cat might chase the rabbit? Peter went back towards the tool shed. Suddenly, quite close to him, he heard a noise of a hoe. Scratch, 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 scratch. Peter scurried underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out, climbed upon a wheelbarrow, and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. So here's Peter hiding in the wood wheelbarrow, Mr. McGregor hoeing his onions, and there's the gate that Peter is looking for. Peter got down very quietly off of the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could along the straight walk behind the black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. And there's Peter outside the gate, looking very content with himself that he has escaped Mr. McGregor's clutches. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds, and Peter stopped running and never looked behind him until he got home to the big fir tree. So here's now a scarecrow made out of Peter's shoes and jacket, and there's Peter running to the safety of home. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. A fortnight is 2 weeks, by the way. And there's Peter sleeping by the fire, and Mrs. Bunny is looking at Peter as our Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail. Okay. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea. She gave a dose of it to Peter, 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. There's the good little bunnies getting their reward of bread and milk and blackberries, and there's Peter being put to bed with his chamomile tea. Well, there's the cautionary tale of Peter Rabbit. In other words, stay out of the garden if you're a rabbit. I hope your garden comes in very well, and we hope to see you fairly soon this summer. Goodbye.